It is time, President Biden said tonight, to end America's longest war. Time for American troops to come home from Afghanistan. NATO troops, including our own, will follow them out.
With the terror threat now in many places, keeping thousands of troops grounded and concentrated in just one country at a cost of billions each year makes little sense to me.
Bradby will look tonight at the war, its human cost and the potential consequences of this decision. Also on News at 10. Tory MPs close ranks to block a full inquiry into the lobbying scandal after a fiery PMQs. A reaction at last. Julie, the terminal cancer patient we featured in squalid accommodation last night, will be moved. But what about all those like her whose voices are still not being heard? Now it's the shocking stories from campuses. Students at universities and colleges all over the country share their experiences of sexual abuse. We're back where it all started for the South African variant. John Irvine reports on just how difficult it's going to be to roll out the vaccine. The Royals release unseen family photos of the Duke as there's a significant development about uniforms at his funeral. And a legend of Pink Floyd reflects on life after lockdown.
The idea of several thousand people milling together in front of you gives me the heebie-jeebies.
This is ITV News at 10 with Tom Bradby.
Good evening. After British troops went into Afghanistan with our American allies following the 9/11 attacks, one Labour Defence Secretary famously said we'd be perfectly happy to leave in 3 years' time without firing one shot. But nearly 20 years, thousands of shots and many lives later, the British deployment will finally end, once again in collaboration with the Americans. Tonight, President Biden confirmed he was pulling out the remaining US troops on the anniversary of the al-Qaeda attacks, September the 11th. It's time to end America's longest war, he said. It's time for US troops to come home. NATO agreed, so the 750 British troops still serving there with NATO will come home too. But 456 British servicemen and women will, of course, never come back. Now the Taliban are once again in charge of areas our troops gave their lives to defend during the so-called war on terror. Many bereaved families and surviving comrades are left asking, was it worth it?
It was the war where America and her British allies spilled blood, only to discover, like others before them, that being a superpower did not guarantee military success in Afghanistan. It began as a response to the 9/11 attacks. Osama bin Laden, the al-Qaeda leader who masterminded them, was being sheltered by the Taliban in Afghanistan. British forces have paid a high price since they were deployed to Afghanistan in 2001. 456 lives were lost in the conflict, with more than 4,200 physically injured. Almost 10,000 NATO troops remain, with the US providing by far the largest contingent. Tonight, President Biden was frank that what became known as America's forever war was over for it and effectively its NATO allies, including Britain.
I've concluded that it's time to end America's longest war. It's time for American troops to come home. I'm now the 4th United States president to preside over American troop presence in Afghanistan. 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats. I will not pass this responsibility onto a 5th.
With the Taliban resurgent and the Western-backed government in Kabul fragile and at risk, tonight Afghanistan's people are fearing a return to a dark chapter of their history.
Unfortunately, this decision was not unexpected, but it is seen by the Afghan people with grave concerns. Targeted assassinations are going on in urban cities. There is no clear prospect for a political settlement that could bring the Taliban to the political fold.
A reflection too on the sacrifice of British troops who died trying to bring peace to a country that could soon be back in civil war. Dog handler Liam Tasker was shot by a Taliban sniper after he and his dog Theo had saved countless lives, uncovering a record number of booby trap devices. His mother Jane says Liam's family and comrades will always feel that loss.
Was it worth it? Because Liam's friends are still suffering now, 10 years later. You know, it's sad, really sad. And I don't think the public realise just the effect it has on the families and the soldiers.
For 200 years, Afghanistan was known as the graveyard of empires. The Russians, the British, and now the Americans met the same fate and epitaph.
And Raghi joins me, of course, to talk about all this. Well, it's been 20 years. I mean, I suppose the fundamental question is the country we're leaving behind any safer than the one we went into?
I think we will leave on September the 11th a country that is carefully poised between a peace process between the Taliban and the Western-backed government that seems to be going nowhere, with everything primed for a civil war. And I think that's really the main sort of fear, that without with the absence of American and NATO troops, will it just crumble in the way that Afghan history has always shown? And I think the proof of the pudding is, if we look at a map, we can see who has control across Afghanistan. Now, the shaded colour here, Tom, shows government control and also some districts that are undetermined. But if we look at the red colour right there, we will see a large proportion of the country which is contested and the rest controlled by the Taliban. And it's not easy for the people of Afghanistan, with more than 3,000 people dying every year. So the logic seems to be that come September the 12th, Afghanistan will, kick back to this kind of history that took us there in the first place. Yeah. I mean, if you look at our history for hundreds of years, it's the empire of the graveyard of empires, and so it's proved.
OK, Raghi, thank you very much for now. No doubt we'll come back to it. Such is the rising concern back here about the lobbying of government ministers. There are now going to be not one, but two inquiries. The Prime Minister had already asked a senior lawyer to investigate what one of his predecessors, David Cameron, had been up to. Mr Johnson said he was concerned about some of the stuff he'd been reading. Labour didn't get their investigation approved by MPs, but now the Treasury Committee has decided to begin its own, starting next week.
The line between government and business, it's meant to be clear and prevent politicians using their contacts and influence for financial gain. But David Cameron's lobbying on behalf of Greensill Capital has raised questions about whether rules were broken or whether they were ever tough enough.
Is there a problem of sleaze in your government, Prime Minister?
Not something he would accept. But he did concede today that perhaps relations had at times got too cosy.
I do think it is a good idea in principle that top civil servants should be able to engage with business and should have experience of the private sector. When I look at the accounts I'm reading today, it's not clear that those boundaries have been properly understood.
For Labour today demanding a full parliamentary inquiry, it was all part of a pattern.
The Greensill scandal is just the tip of the iceberg. Dodgy contracts, privileged access, jobs for their mates. This is the return of Tory sleaze.
But what, if anything, did Boris Johnson know? One backbencher asked.
Will the Prime Minister tell this House when he last spoke to former Prime Minister David Cameron?
The honest truth, I cannot remember when I last spoke to Dave, but I can, if she wants to know whether I've had any contact with him about any of the matters that have been in the press, the answer is no.
This all centres on Lex Greensill, brought into Number 10 by David Cameron as a part-time advisor, but also the founder of a financial services company, Greensill Capital, which bid for government contracts. In 2018, David Cameron, now out of office, became an advisor to the company himself, lobbying ministers and officials on its behalf. It's now emerged that a senior civil servant, Bill Crothers, in charge of government procurement, was working for Greensill at the same time as the government. This former civil servant says that came as quite a shock.
I think everybody was just extremely surprised, a lot of eyebrows raising, because I think particularly when you've got somebody who's running government procurement, that's such a direct and obvious conflict of interest. It's very difficult to see how anyone ever thought that was a good idea.
Meanwhile, tonight it's been revealed that the former Metropolitan Police Commissioner, Lord Hogan Howe, was also hired to work for a subsidiary of Greensill Capital last year, while acting as an advisor in the Cabinet Office. But there's no suggestion he lobbied for any contracts on their behalf. Libby Vina, News at 10, Westminster.
Well, Robert joins us from the studio where he's filming tonight's Peston programme, of course, it being a Wednesday night. Robert, look, this is getting pretty serious and questions seem to be being raised about some of those very close to the Prime Minister.
Yeah, look, tons of developments tonight. One of the things I disclosed earlier on today is that his Deputy Chief of Staff, Baroness Finn, Simone Finn, she retains a stake of between 25% and 50% in a business, Francis Moore Associates, that advises governments. The Downing Street tells me that they will be policing things so that there is no impropriety there. Francis Moore has told me that it advises foreign governments, not the British government, but there will be a significant perception of a conflict of interest there. Meanwhile, the Cabinet Secretary, Simon Case, has disclosed that he doesn't know how many civil servants have sort of jobs on the side with the private sector. And he's written to all senior civil servants saying, tell me those, who in the civil service is getting money from outside. An astonishing sort of issue for a British civil service that is supposed to be absolutely free from these conflicts of interest. And tonight, Lex Greensill has made it clear that he will break his silence. He will say precisely what he did in terms of lobbying the government. So it is very messy. It is very complicated. It's not looking, frankly, good for the reputation of the government. Boris Johnson has promised one review. We've got another one coming from the Treasury Select Committee, and we'll almost certainly see other Select Committee reviews. Tonight, a senior lobbyist on my show, Ian Anderson, said he thinks the current rules are absolutely appalling, need ripping up and starting again.
OK, Robert, more and more intriguing for now. Thank you very much indeed. If you're watching last night's programme, you will not have forgotten the awful, the frankly disgusting conditions that cancer patient Julie Roberts was living out her life. This is her flat in Newquay in Cornwall, infested with damp and mould. She told us she'd complained, but it was never fixed. Well, after appearing on News at 10 last night, something has been done, funnily enough. The management company which runs the property has offered her a 2-bedroom home to move into by the end of next week. That is great news, clearly, though it doesn't change the fact we have been deluged by similar stories. And Dan, whose story it was, joins me now. But let's just focus on this, because it is very positive news for Julie, who was living in, frankly, shocking conditions.
It is, Tom, and we have witnessed, haven't we, some of the most appalling housing conditions as part of this investigation. People living in the most kind of unimaginable, unlivable squalor, none more so than Julie Roberts. Her flat infested with mould and damp, all while she's been treated for incurable cancer. She moved in 7 years ago, raised a complaint then. For many years, she's tried to wash it off herself, but as her cancer got worse, that wasn't an option. And for several months, her complaints have fallen on deaf ears with the management company who run the property, Mears. It's a familiar story, isn't it, Tom? People complain and complain, nothing gets done. Our intervention here, her appearing on ITV News, led last night to the company Mears saying that they would fix the problem. Today they have offered her a 2-bedroom home that she can move into next week. We've spoken to Julie today. She is, of course, relieved, but she expressed frustration that it has taken this intervention, speaking to the press effectively, to get her life changed, and also, even in her own condition right now, expressed concern for others in a similar position.
Obviously, I'm happy that I've got a place. But I do worry about other people in the same situation, as they're not being listened to, they're not being heard, and obviously nothing's getting done. But all tenants should be listened to.
Now, Mears say they're going to look at the property, other flats in that property, and properties across their whole portfolio, which is thousands across the country. We know, though, tonight, Tom, there will be families going to bed tonight, waking up tomorrow morning in squalid conditions, and they will not be able to have what Julie has had, which is a new home, because there are simply not enough of them to go around.
Dan, thank you very much. I know you will keep investigating. OK, an update too on another story we've been covering, the racist insults directed at the Rangers player Glenn Kamara. When we spoke to Glenn a week ago, he was understandably very angry that the Slavia Prague defender Ondrej Kudela, who abused him during a Europa League game, was initially given a one-match ban. Well, today, Kudela was banned for 10 matches by European football bosses in European competitions. Under UEFA rules, a 10-match ban is the minimum punishment for a racist offence. Glenn said it should not have been just the minimum. In the months since the website Everyone's Invited first exposed the hidden scourge of sexual abuse and sexual violence at a string of exclusive schools, girls and young women have learned they are sadly not alone. Thousands have posted shocking accounts of what happened. Now, Everyone's Invited have told us that 86 universities feature in reports of sexual assault and harassment. In a single week, 1,000 women contacted the website about what they'd suffered whilst they were students.
Being away from home for the first time should be all about freedom. And for some students, this week feels like a new beginning. But others are living with an old fear, not of the virus, but sexual harassment and worse. Katie, whose identity we're disguising, was sexually assaulted in her first year by another student. When her complaint was made light of, it took the heaviest of tolls.
It's taken virtually my whole university experience. I spent my 3 years at university always looking over my shoulder, and it's taken a toll on my work, definitely, my social life, my mental health, having to be dependent on medication that I never was before just because I couldn't get the support that I needed.
The university and the sports society Katie belonged to finally acted, but by then the damage was done.
I would have to plan to leave the house an hour early to allow time for the anxiety attack I was going to have, knowing that the perpetrator was somewhere on campus. I was terrified. I think there's a lack of understanding on an institutional level for the personal effects that it has on your life.
Katie's experience isn't isolated. In the space of just 1 week, over 1,000 students submitted testimonies of sexual assault and harassment experienced at UK universities. 86 institutions in total, named by the campaign group Everyone's Invited, with the University of Exeter mentioned 65 times, Oxford University cited in 57 accounts, and Edinburgh University in 53. All three of them have told ITV News they are actively tackling violence against women. But for these 4 students studying at London universities, that behaviour is inescapable. Fellow students have stalked them, groped them, and even marked them out of 10.
I'm involved in sports societies a lot. I know a lot of them, a lot of men at sports societies keep lists of girls they slept with, and sometimes they rape them as well.
I was walking through the crowd and I just found someone put his hand on my body, and I was shocked. I just didn't know what to do. I didn't know whether to run, whether to scream, whether to stand. I was just completely paralyzed.
I've had similar situations where it's midday and I'm leaving uni, and you'll have guys stalk you out of a train and hold on to you. And fine, they're trying to be persistent. They're like, hey, let me get your number, miss, whatever. But the fact that, it's midday and I'm trying to get home safely.
They're fighting back, part of the Our Streets Now movement, determined, like the founder of Everyone's Invited, to expose a hidden culture of abuse that stretches way beyond education.
It's about the sexism, the misogyny, the victim blaming. It's about the deeply entrenched attitudes and beliefs, the sexism that exists at the fabric of our society.
For many women, it's been a difficult few weeks to reflect on. Education may well offer some of the answers, but right now our universities, like our schools, face some big questions. Rachel Younger, News at 10.
Still to come, why the Queen has decided no member of the royal family will wear a military uniform at Prince Philip's funeral. And we travel to the Eastern Cape, where the South African variant being urgently chased down in the UK first emerged. Those stories and more after the break. Welcome back. It has become clear this evening that none of the royal menfolk at the funeral of Prince Philip will wear uniform after all. The Queen is said to have taken the decision after speculation both about Prince Harry, who's lost his military ranks, and about Prince Andrew. There have been reports of displeasure in the Royal Navy about him wanting to wear an admiral's uniform. There was no sign of any uniforms in a relaxed photo from 3 years ago, released this evening, showing Prince Philip with some of his great-grandchildren.
With the Cambridge children on one side of them and Princess Anne's grandchildren on the other, a rare photo in an intimate setting in Balmoral, released tonight by Buckingham Palace. The Queen has Prince Louis on her lap as she and Prince Philip sit with 7 of their great-grandchildren in 2018. Other family images released tonight show the Duke of Edinburgh with William and Kate shortly after Princess Charlotte was born. And this photo, at a polo match in 1966, was released by the Prince of Wales, all to remember Philip, the family man.
And Prince Philip's speedboat rip-roaring into the picture with Prince Charles aboard.
Sailing in general and sailing on the Solent in particular were some of Prince Philip's most loved passions. He took a young Prince Charles sailing off the Isle of Wight, as well as Princess Anne, this is her, in 1965. It was why the Queen said she still wanted Princess Anne to fulfil her engagement on the island today, despite officially being in the 2-week royal mourning. Anne spoke of her early memories here.
You know, this was, the early memories, this was days out, which were great fun.
Great fun was what she called her time with her father at the Cowes Week Regatta. But the Princess Royal did acknowledge that her father had high standards when it came to sailing in his favourite racing boat Cowslip. Her father, she said, considered her too young.
I was considered, I think, too young and a bit of a nuisance.
And on the drill square of the Purbright Barracks in Surrey today, the men and women from the Army, Navy and RAF kept up their rehearsals ahead of the funeral. But the military uniforms will not, we understand, be worn by any members of the royal family. A safety-first decision, given Prince Andrew's situation, but also Prince Harry's official departure when his military roles were removed. It's a decision that's been taken to keep the focus of the funeral on the family man, not on anything else. Chris Ship, News at 10.
Northern Ireland's First Minister Arlene Foster has told the court that being on the end of an unsubstantiated claim that she had an affair was humiliating and left her very, very upset. Mrs Foster had brought a libel case against the TV doctor Christian Jessen, who tweeted about rumours she was having a relationship with a police protection officer. She told the court she'd had to reassure her children and her elderly mother that the rumour was not true. We've heard plenty about the South African variant of coronavirus in recent days, what with the surge testing in South London, and there's now an unrelated case in North London. The variant first appeared near the city of Pretoria in the Eastern Cape province back in August. Since then, cases and deaths in Eastern Cape have gone up and up. The distressing irony is that it is the place where it began. It is so difficult to get the vaccine to those who need it most.
Bucolic and beautiful it may be, but a shadow hangs over the scenic Eastern Cape. When it comes to coronavirus, this is the deadliest place on earth. Across the province, the illness has killed 1 in every 300. At its height, 40% of test results came back positive. The Eastern Cape earned this unenviable distinction through extreme poverty, inadequate health services, and because it was here that the South African variant originated back in August last year. Chuma was an intensive care nurse at a main hospital during the worst of it.
It was highly stressful because the patients that were admitted were not allowed to be visited by their families. So you just have to call the family when the patient has passed on.
Today, Nurse Chuma works for a charity called Bulangula Incubator that runs a small clinic in a remote corner of the Cape. There are no paved roads and almost no cars. And if the people who reach here can't get the necessary treatment, they have to trek for another few hours and cross a river to reach a government clinic far away on the other side. The tortuous journey highlights just how tough it's going to be to distribute vaccines in part of the world crying out for them.
It's going to be a logistical nightmare, and it's needing to understand what deep rural means. We can't treat it the same as cities. We can't expect somebody to go to their local clinic or their local hospital. Look how far away that is. We need to bring the vaccines into these communities.
Lynn and her team run a radio station to keep people entertained and up to date regarding coronavirus. In a land with no TV signal, the wireless is vital.
So when the corona came, we just used this community radio to inform people about everything.
Vaccinating South Africa will be an uphill struggle, which experts predict will take more than a decade to complete. It's a cruel irony that this, the part of the world in greatest need, is so hard to provide for. John Irvine, News at 10, the Eastern Cape.
The biggest swindler of all time, the American financier Bernie Madoff, has died in prison at the age of 82. He was 12 years into a 150-year sentence for defrauding investors, some of them high-profile, like film director Steven Spielberg and actor Kevin Bacon, out of £12.5 billion altogether. He died of old age. Finally, as life gets a little more normal, the thoughts of rock and roll legends who've been stuck at home are turning to performing again. Sir Mick Jagger hasn't let the grass or moss grow under his feet. He's put out a new record about coming out of lockdown. But the Pink Floyd singer and songwriter David Gilmour is being, well, a little less rock and roll. He and his wife Polly Sampson have been making music during lockdown, but he says being back in front of an audience would give him, as he put it, the heebie-jeebies, at least until the virus is sorted.
It sounds like a lockdown song, people sitting around.
These are the Gilmour family lockdown sessions.
It's an idea someday.
Called the Von Trapped series, David Gilmour and his wife, writer Polly Sampson, had intended to use the set behind them on a tour to promote her new book, A Theatre for Dreamers, set on a Greek island. But instead, enlisting family members, they did these musical live streams. Now, as lockdown lifts, it's all changed.
Because all our children have escaped.
They've all escaped.
It's
The Von
just the two of
Trapps
us.
have got away. We're the only We're the only
They're no
Von
longer
Trapps.
trapped.
Yes, I have ghosts, but all of them dead.
The Pink Floyd guitarist recorded a new single to accompany the book, but has cancelled plans to perform it on stage anytime soon. He's not the only rock star pondering the future. Mick Jagger and Dave Grohl's new single looks back on lockdown and forward to normality. The Gilmour household remains cautious.
The idea of several thousand people milling together in front of you gives me the heebie-jeebies. I'd hate to be doing a gig in front of all those people at this moment in time. Until this thing is totally defeated, under control, fairly much worldwide, I'm not going to be doing any shows.
There are festivals going ahead in July, or scheduled to go ahead in July.
So they say.
Can you see a lot of lockdown literature and lockdown music resulting from this period?
I think there will be obviously some big novels and some big films and some big box sets, that there are bound to be, but I don't think it's going to be massive because I think people do want to escape.
I'm sure there will be gigs and there will be tours again.
And it's lovely to gather in in a massive place, in a massive crowd. I mean, that is one of the great pleasures of life, to see a band in a big stadium. I mean, not one of my favourite things.
I don't want to go and see a band in a big stadium. Don't mind being in the band.
At least the family sing-alongs have offered a stage for now, albeit with limited applause. Nina Nanar, News at 10.
What would we all give to be back in big stadiums, or even on those beaches in Greece? That's it for tonight. Good night. Thank you very much for watching.